Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Julien Jordani, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about the new Doctoral Networks program that we have in Horizon Europe. So if we go to the next slide, you will see basically the Doctoral Network was used to be the ITN, Innovative Training Networks in H2020, so now it's called Doctoral Networks. As was mentioned before, the main principles of the ITN remain in the doctoral networks with some simplification. So it is still a multi-beneficiary action. So basically consortia apply and submit proposals. And the point of this consortia is that they set up a doctoral program, so with a program that has an overall coherence, and they're going to recruit fellows, so doctoral candidates, which all of them will have their own individual research project, and that's the core of the doctoral network. So there are three modalities, if you wish. So there's the standard doctoral network program, and there is also the industrial doctorates, which puts more emphasis on the cross-sectoral training between the academy and the industry, with joint supervision from the two sectors. There is the joint doctorates, which aims at having double or multiple or joint degrees between different academic institutions. So as all the MSCA action, it's a bottom-up action, so there's no pre-identified topic. Any area of science can submit a proposal, and the point is really to, well, build the European capital of Europe. So the strong focus is on the long-term employability of the fellows that will be recruited in this doctoral networks. So the researchers that are going to be recruited there should be exposed to the academic and the non-academic sector, and they should also have, on top of their own project, they should have training, technical training, of course, but also training on transferable skills. And this is also the link to the long-term employability of the researchers. They should have a career development plan, and they should, I mean, the whole power of the network should be harnessed, meaning that the fellows would be exposed to different environments through secondments in the different beneficiaries of the network. So if we go to the next slide, you will see, so who can apply? So it's basically consortia who apply, and those consortia can be composed of universities, research institutions, businesses, SMEs, NGOs, any independent legal entity, really. So it should be at least three. So there should be at least three independent legal entities, each established in a different member state or associated country. One thing that is different from Horizon 2020 is that one of those three has to be from a member state. So you could not have, for instance, a consortium composed of Norway, Turkey, and Israel. This is not possible any longer. At least one of them has to be from a member state. All the beneficiaries, they have to recruit at least one doctoral candidate, okay? And they are required to host this doctoral candidate at their premises. There is a rule about the budget, which was the same as in H2020, that no more than 40% of the EU contribution may be allocated to beneficiaries of the same country. This is basically to ensure somehow a geographical distribution of funding, to not have some consortia that are too much skewed towards one country. And this is a multi-beneficiary scheme. So if we go to the next slide, I talked about beneficiary, but there's another kind of entities that can join a doctoral network. And it's basically, so beneficiaries, as the name suggests, are entities that directly receive funds from the European Union to run the project. They sign the grant agreement, They have to recruit the researchers, so at least one researcher per beneficiary, and they claim costs directly. But there's a possibility to be involved in a doctoral network by being an associated partner. So an associated partner does not sign the grant agreement, does not recruit researchers. They should not recruit any researchers, but there can be entities that have an interest in joining a doctoral network as an associated partners, because maybe they can contribute through, they can offer secondments, for instance, to the fellows in the project. They can maybe provide training. They can participate in the supervisory board. Maybe they have some insights from a different sector or angle to bring to the project, but they don't claim cost directly, so they are not beneficiaries. So that's another way to participate in these doctoral networks. If we go to the next slide, you will see that there's a bit of novelties about the eligibility of researchers. So the researchers that are going to be recruited in doctoral networks, they have to be doctoral candidates. So the condition is that they should not already have a doctoral degree at the date of recruitment. So there is no notion about early stage anymore. They shouldn't have a doctoral degree. They all need to be enrolled in a doctoral program in the project. So this is not an option anymore. They have to be enrolled in the doctoral program. They can be of any nationality. They can be from around the world. I mean, the thing we mentioned before about the consortium eligibility are for the institution, but the researchers recruited can come from anywhere in the world. And there is a mobility rule, because what would be Marie-Skłodowska reactions without mobility rule? They can't have resided or carried out their main activity in the countries where they are recruited for more than 12 months in the previous 36 months. So they have to undergo some kind of mobility before they start. If we go to the next slide, there were mentioned before about this demand management driven actions to try to increase a bit the success rate of the program. So in doctoral networks as well, there is a very high number of proposals, and with the budget that we have, even if it's a large budget, I think at the beginning of H2020 it was about 7% success rate, and towards the end it was about 10%. Now the standard doctoral network are restricted to a maximum of 360 person month. So before it used to be 540, now it's 360. So you will have smaller projects and potentially we can fund more. There's an incentive to opt for a joint doctorate or an industrial doctorate, and this incentive is that you can recruit more people. You can have up to 540 person month, so as was the case in the past. The duration of the project as a whole is still 48 months maximum, and the fellowship, so the duration of each fellow's contract is still between 3 and 36 months. A bit of simplification for the secondments. Now each fellow can go on secondments for up to 1/3 of their fellowship duration. In the past, it was 30%. 30% of 36 months was not quite 1 year, so now it's 1 year, 12 months. For industrial doctorates, all the fellows need still to spend at least 50% of their time in the non-academic sector, and there should be a joint supervision between the academic and non-academic sector. In terms of the calls, so the call from this year, so I was said before, the call is, well, technically it's published because you have all the templates and all the guide for applicants and everything, but it's not yet open. We hope that it will be the case in the days to come. The deadline to submit is the 16th of November. There will be a second call on 2022, and important to notice that from 2022 onwards, there will be resubmission restrictions. So any proposal that received a score below 80% cannot resubmit in 2022, from 2022 onwards. Next slide, please. In terms of funding, so this is still the same system of unit costs. So basically, one unit is 1 month spent by a fellow at the beneficiary's place. So this is the fixed amount composed of a living allowance. So this is basically the salary of the fellow, the mobility allowance that has to be paid for everyone. That's because each fellow had to undergo mobility before they start their project. And now, as was mentioned before, the family allowance, which can be now requested during the project of the fellow, if the fellow gets entitled to a family allowance. There's a long-term leave allowance and the special needs allowance as well, which can be requested in the middle of the project. This is a contribution for the researchers, so this money has to go to the fellow directly, and there's an institutional unit contribution. This is the cost of running the project, basically, managing the project, running the research and everything. And I think if we go to the next slide, that's almost the end. The award criteria, so I would invite you to pay attention to the wording of the sub-criteria. It's still the same principles with excellence, impact, and implementation, but you will see that there's some little differences sometimes in the sub-criteria. So I invite you to pay attention to the novelties compared to H2020. And if we go to the next slide, this is my thank you slide. So thank you very much for your attention. And of course, I'm here to reply to your questions, should you have any. Thank you very much.
Julien, there are questions for you. Can you read them or do you want me to read them?
So for the moment, I see questions for COFUND and postdocs. I don't see the...
I can read them for you if you want.
But well, maybe yes, if you don't mind.
Yes, so for Doctoral Network, can a company, a large entity, take part as beneficiary and receive funding for doctoral salary, monthly equipment costs?
Absolutely, if the question is, can a company be a beneficiary in a doctoral network project? Yes. So, and we had that also in H2020 and FP7 in the past. So companies, universities, research performers, they can do that.
Okay. Does an industry partner's PhD students, sorry, this has disappeared, can associate partners be paid for their services?
Yes. So basically what happens is that the institutional costs that go to the beneficiaries, this should not be understood as the cost of running research or the project for one specific fellow. This is money that can be redistributed within the consortium and used, for the purpose. For instance, you might have beneficiaries that organizes more training or that has more management costs. So this money can be redistributed in the consortium. Usually that's how associated partners actually gets indirectly funded for their activities. This money from the institutional costs pool can be paid to an associated partner for instance, hosting a seconded fellow or for organizing trainings. This is usually decided by the consortium through the consortium agreement. But yes, that's the way that an associated partner would get money for the services they give.
Okay, I see we still have a bit of time for the next question. Does the requirement to enroll recruited researchers in a PhD program mean they have to finish their PhD before the end of the action?
No, this is not a requirement, which is also good news because there's lots of PhDs that cannot be finished within 36 months. So no, it's not a requirement that they finish their PhD within the project. It's a requirement that they're enrolled in a doctoral program.
Okay, that's clear. The next one, can you explain a bit more the mobility requirements? How can someone be a PhD. This question has disappeared, but
it's too dynamic, it goes too
yeah,
fast.
it's a bit, yes, now I find it. Okay, maybe I'll ask another one. Does an industry partner PhD student spend 100% of their time at the company? This is related to the standard doctoral program, Doctoral Network.
If they are enrolled in a PhD, yes. Of course, secondments are encouraged but are not mandatory. So it is technically possible. It's within the rule that they spend 100% of their time in the company, but they have to be enrolled in a PhD program.
Are tuition fees covered?
Yes. So the fellows should not have to pay for tuition fees under this program. It should be paid through the DN funding.
And coordination costs?
Coordination costs are part of the institutional cost. So there's a research and training cost, and there's a management cost. So yeah, this should come from the institutional costs.
Can you associate as a partner of the consortia after the doctoral network has started?
Yes, it is possible. In that case, you will contact your project officer for the project that follows up your project, and it is possible to associate a new partner after the start of a project, yes.
Please, this is very dynamic. What is the equivalent of the previous ITN, ETN? Is it industrial or joint doctorates?
So the ETN would be the doctoral network standard. The previous EID, so European Industrial Doctorate, is the new ID, Industrial Doctorates, and the previous EJDs, European Joint Doctorates, is a new JD, Joint Doctorates. So you just skip the European, if you wish.
Can you clarify how the recruitment will work for the joint doctorates?
I'm not sure I get the question right, but for any of the three modalities of doctoral networks, the key is that the recruitment has to be open, transparent, and fair, and widely advertised. So the point is, contrary to the standard doctoral training, where usually universities just fish in their pond of master's degree students, the point here is to open it to the world and to be able to show that you selected the people that you selected based on predefined criteria and open and transparent procedure. It's not different for joint doctorates. The difference with joint doctorates is that there are joint supervision, and there's at the end of the program there should be a joint or multiple degree given to the fellows. So you have to agree on the different curricula. This is what makes it a bit more, let's say, difficult or challenging for the joint doctorates.
Okay. There is a question on the resubmission rule, which you explained that was introduced because of demand management issues. So when is a proposal resubmission? Can you explain, for example, if there is a change of one beneficiary, small changes in the content, etc.? Can you explain on which basis this proposal will be considered as resubmitted?
As far as I know, the technical details on what is considered the resubmission is not yet finalized. So unless someone else has different information than I do, I think for the moment we just lay the principle that of resubmission restrictions. It's true that in doctoral in ITN we had almost half of the proposals at some point were resubmission. So the point is to try to avoid that as much as possible. But yes, whether you change one beneficiary is enough to make it a new proposal. I can't reply to you at this stage.
I think we can take one or two more questions. So will a standard or joint or an industrial doctoral network on the same topic be evaluated within the same thematic panels? For example, engineering, physics, etc. Or are they different panels for the three?
So there are 8 panels because there are 8 scientific panels. So life science, mathematics, physics, economics, engineering, etc., etc. So each proposal submitted within one panel will be evaluated within this panel and will compete against all the other proposals submitted within the same panel. So there will be 8 budgets, if you wish. And if, let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that there are 3 proposals that address the same sort of topic and that are submitted within the same panel, then they will be evaluated within the same panel and compete against each other. I'm not sure. I hope that's the question. I got the question right.
I hope so. Otherwise, maybe participants will come up with a new question. A question as well, which is let's say attracting lots of attention, is what kind of pre-agreement should be set between partners to participate in the joint doctorate action? Because I think you mentioned that there is a novelty there.
Yes, yes. And this was done basically because usually the time needed to agree between different institutions to make up a joint degree was vastly underestimated. So now we ask basically that there's at least a pre-agreement that's done. This pre-agreement should be signed by the authorized representatives of the different institutions to give it a bit more weight. And there is, I think there is a template. I'm sorry for the vagueness of my reply right now, but I'm pretty sure there is a template, but I can double check that. Maybe put that on the.
I think there is a template, yes.
Yes.
There is a template. My colleague Alan, do you want to intervene, Alan? Or
I'm not particularly clear. It's just on the previous question when it wasn't, nobody was exactly clear what it meant. I mean, my interpretation, which could well be wrong, is an engineering proposal in the JD ranked against an engineering proposal in the other stream. So that's why I said I thought the question meant are there 24 ranking lists, or rather 8 ranking lists.
Right. So if the question is are there 8 or 24 ranking lists? There's 8 ranking lists. So now, as opposed to what was done in the past, a JD proposal will compete against ID's proposals and DN proposals, all in the same scientific panel.
okay, thank you very much. I hope that this clarified the questions. We've addressed the most, let's say, popular questions, and now we need to move to the next session on staff exchanges. So you need to leave this session and go on the next link to the presentation on staff exchanges. And thank you very much to Julien.
Hello, good afternoon. I don't think that anybody has to leave.
Yes, no, right. It's the same link indeed.
It's the same session. So good afternoon from my part. My name is Marlène Barthez, and I'll quickly walk you through the new staff exchange action of the MSCA, which used to be called RISE, for those who are familiar with the previous edition. So Research and Innovation Staff Exchanges, now shortened to just Staff Exchanges, to make it a little bit more easy. I'm happy to say that this is the action with the fewest changes compared to the previous framework program. It is also the most international action under the MSCA, with the highest number of participation from non-associated third country institutions. So we're quite happy about that. It's also, I would say, the most open and flexible action, meaning that it is able to accommodate the needs of creative and innovative scientists, and is open also to a more risk-taking approach. If we go to the next slide, you will see the general presentation or the main objectives of the staff exchange action. As for the other MSCA actions, the idea here is to promote international, intersectoral, and interdisciplinary mobility, so the triple I's, through the exchange of research and innovation staff. And that's called a secondment, okay? So the mobility of staff through secondments. What we want to do is to strengthen knowledge transfer between participating organizations. So here the idea is to welcome and to reward creativity and entrepreneurship, and to turn innovative ideas into products, services, and processes. The MSCA staff exchange action also involves the academic and the non-academic sector. There's actually a very strong focus on non-academic sector participation, including small and medium enterprises. And then finally, of course, one of the main objectives is cooperation worldwide across the globe. So what we want to do is to strengthen the human capital base in Europe and beyond. We also want to increase Europe's attractiveness as a leading destination for research and innovation. And we want to contribute to Europe's competitiveness and growth. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see a little bit more the expected outcomes for the individual staff members that will be sent around, as well as for the organizations. They are pretty straightforward. I mean, for the staff members, for instance, one of the main outcomes is to give them, or to increase their research and transferable skills and competences, which should hopefully lead to increased or improved employability and career prospects. Staff members will see their knowledge and their innovative ideas converted into products, processes, and services. They will also benefit from increased international exposure, which should lead to extended networks and opportunities. For organizations, one of the main outcomes is, of course, the transfer of knowledge between sectors, so academic and non-academic, and between disciplines. It should, as for the other MSCA actions, lead to strengthened and broader international, interdisciplinary, and intersectoral collaborative networks. So that's the triple I, as I mentioned before, and hopefully it should also boost the research and innovation capacity of all the participating organizations. If we go to the next slide, we have a look at activities under staff exchanges. So a little bit more concretely, what kind of activities do we have to support the objectives that I just mentioned? So the main goal is to implement a joint research and innovation project through the secondment of eligible staff members. So you either send or you host. The staff exchanges should address the three dimensions of mobility that I just mentioned. So again, intersectoral, international, and interdisciplinary. There's a new rule here compared to the previous one. So normally, exchanges between organizations in an EU member state or associated country should be intersectoral, meaning they should be between the academic and the non-academic sectors. If you want to do exchanges from the same sector, so let's say from a university to another university, that's also possible, especially within Europe, but it has to be interdisciplinary. So this is a novelty. I'll mention it again a little bit later, because I know it can be confusing. And then this interdisciplinarity, so the need for same sector exchanges to be between different disciplines doesn't apply if the secondment is with a non-associated third country. So there, if you have a university exchanges between a European country and a third country. It doesn't necessarily have to be between different disciplines. It could be the same discipline as well. The project should inter alia enable networking activities, of course, and the organization of workshops, conferences. That's to facilitate knowledge transfer and testing of innovative approaches. And then finally, for the participating staff members, the project should offer new skills acquisition and career development perspectives. So it is also important here that the participating organizations make sure that the seconded staff member is adequately mentored. On the next slide, we go a little bit more into, well, the concrete setup of a staff exchange project. So these are the participating organizations, or regarding the participating organizations who can apply. Applications have to be submitted by a consortium of at least 3 legal entities in 3 different countries, okay? And out of these 3 countries, 2 should be a different EU member state or Horizon Europe associated country. So 2 organizations in 2 different EU countries or associated countries, and then 1 more either also in Europe, or it could also be elsewhere in the world. That's why I said that this action is quite international. Now, let's imagine all the organizations are from the same sector, so either academic or non-academic. Then there must be 1 organization from a third country, okay? That's one of the minimum rules, because as I explained previously, if you second staff between organizations in member states or associated countries, they should be between different sectors, or they should be interdisciplinary for the same sector exchanges. And then there's a limit. So if you do the same, so interdisciplinary secondments within the same sector in Europe, then there's a maximum limit. So it should be no more than 1/3 of the total duration or month of your action or your project. And then obviously all secondments must always happen between different countries. So you cannot send, I don't know, between French institutions staff. So it always has to be international, cross-border. On the next slide, we see a little bit the eligibility criteria for the individuals, so the staff that are going to be seconded. Here, a little bit different from the other MSCA actions is that actually it's any type of staff that's eligible, as long as they contribute, obviously, to research and innovation activities. So it could be researchers, PhD candidates, postdoctoral researchers. It could be administrative staff, managerial staff, or technical staff, as long as they are contributing to the research and innovation activities. If the staff is a researcher, any career stage, so doctoral candidate or postdoctoral researcher. And then there's one condition: if a staff is selected, he or she should be involved in research or innovation activities at least 1 month prior to the secondment at the sending institution. If we look more at the period, so the right side of the screen, for one individual staff member, they can be seconded minimum 1 month, a maximum of 12 months. And this could be split into several stays. So the same staff member could go 3 months to Germany, and then 3 more months to Italy, and then let's say another 4 months or more to Japan. The staff needs to be devoted full-time to the action during the secondment, so he should focus his work really on the staff exchange project. And after the secondment, he or she should come back to his or her sending institution. And that's important because this is also how we maximize the impact of the exchange, and that's how we also ensure transfer of knowledge and long-term collaboration. The next slide highlights the features, the concrete features of a staff exchange project. So the duration of a project is 4 years, 48 months for the total project implementation, so from A to Z. Under one project, you can receive a maximum of 360 person months. So this is aligned with the other MSCA actions. The secondments, as I said, are between 1 month to 12 months per staff member. And this new rule that I mentioned previously, so if you want to do secondments within the same sector in Europe, it should be it's possible, but it should be interdisciplinary, and there's a cap, so there's a limit of these same sector secondments, and that's 1/3 of the project's total person months. So as I said, total person months is maximum 360. So 1/3 of that could be spent on interdisciplinary secondments in the same sector in Europe. It can be a little bit confusing, but that's the rule. The calls, so here you have the deadlines for the 2021 and 2022 calls. So they are not out yet. They will be published on, well, the first one will be published on the 7th of October. And the closure or the deadline for applications is next year in March, on the 9th of March. So you still have quite some time to prepare your project proposals, to find partners, yes, and to sit down and draft your application once it is open. You see a little bit the budget for the calls, so it's around 70 million euros in total. The next slide shows the unit contributions or the money associated to your staff exchange project. So we are talking in any MSCA action, it can be also a bit confusing. So we always speak in person months. So that's basically the budget that you get for 1 month and 1 person. So here, if we look at the different categories, you see it's split in 2. So we have the contribution for the staff member himself or herself, and then the contribution for the institution. It's a bit different from the other MSCA actions, meaning that here you get, or the individual researcher or staff gets a top-up allowance of 2,300 euros. So this should cover the travel, accommodation, and subsistence costs. This money comes on top of the staff member's salary. So this is a little light bulb that you can see here. Organizations are supposed to continue paying the salary of the staff during the secondment. We have the special needs allowance in case of disabilities, for instance, so if applicable. And then you have the institutional unit contribution. So that's the money that goes to the institutions in the project. So you can see that split into research, training, and networking, and then management and indirect contribution. Now, if we, for instance, add all this up, so 1 person month would be a total of 4,600 euros, half for the researcher or the staff, half for the institution. And then if you multiply this by 360 person months, which is a maximum that can be requested for a project, that would be more or less 1.6 million euros for 1 staff exchange project. And finally, the next slide, which is the award criteria. Like for the other MSCA actions, there's 3 of them: excellence, impact, quality, and efficiency of the implementation. I believe that proposal scoring equal or above 70% will be considered for funding. These award criteria are really important, so make sure to read them carefully and to address all of them. Make sure to highlight the complementarity and the synergies between the partners involved in the consortium. So the consortium is more than the sum of the different parts. Make sure to explain how the knowledge transfer will happen between the partners, what each partner brings and contributes to the project. Make sure to address the triple I's: international, interdisciplinary, intersectoral. We keep repeating them, it's not for nothing. Highlight the impact on the different levels. So for the researcher, for the beneficiaries, at European level, at international level. Make sure to explain how you're going to disseminate your results to the academic community, but also the general public, and how the impact of your project will be measured. I mean, all of these things are really important and should not be omitted in your application. You should highlight, for instance, also the opportunities for the individuals to acquire new skills. You should have a credible strategy for managing intellectual property. I think this could help you get extra points. And then finally, for the implementation, of course, we're looking at monitoring and risks. So you should have a coherent plan to monitor your project or the progress of your project and to mitigate risk, because this will, of course, enhance the credibility of your proposal. You should outline the strong points of each partner. So do they have special facilities, laboratories? Do they have significant collaborations, etc.? So this is for the award criteria. Finally, this is my last slide, tips and tricks. These are across the board. So they could, they're quite generic, but you should still keep them in mind when you are preparing your application, be it for staff exchanges or any other MSCA actions. So please read the work program and really step by step follow the core requirements. So you should be in line with the action's objectives, with the expected outcomes that I have just presented. There is a lot of material out there, guidelines that you can use. So, the guide for applicants, it's not out there yet, but it will be once the staff exchange call is published. So make sure that you use the different material that will be put out there, be it templates, the guide for applicants, etc. So really have a look. Make sure that you highlight the EU dimension in your proposal. So you should show that your proposal addresses EU policy priorities. Claire mentioned them in her introduction earlier on, be it the Green Deal or the digital transition, etc. So make sure, if your project is relevant in one of these areas, to also highlight this. Get a second opinion, seems obvious, of course, but have your proposal proofread. Make sure that you're gonna, that your collaboration, that you're thinking about the sustainability also long term. So describe the benefits of cooperation and how they can, go beyond the 4 years of the project. We love to hear about sustainability. And then if you have a national contact point, so NCP, make use of him or her. They're here to help and they're very knowledgeable, so they could give you very relevant tips during the preparation of your application. And with this, I end my presentation. I'm happy to take some questions and then to hand over to the next speaker.
Marlene, do you see the questions?
Not yet, but I probably soon will.
Okay, so I will start asking them until you see them. Do organizations from third non-EU countries need to make any kind of formal agreement to be eligible?
No, any third country institution is eligible. They cannot be beneficiaries of a project. So that's for legal entities in EU member state or associated countries, but they can be part. So a third country organization can be part of the consortium. And then, of course, it needs, there's a consortium agreement, and then, yes, there's the official templates that are used by the Commission, but there's nothing additional to that.
During secondment, salary cannot be covered from any other project, right? National, institutional. So funding rate is actually much lower than 100%.
Now I see the questions. Okay, so
see them. Okay.
During the secondment, the salary cannot be covered. For us, it doesn't matter where the salary comes from, as long as the salary is paid. So there's this, of course, there's a rule that you cannot use other MSCA funds, for instance, to cover this under a staff exchange project, but as long as the salary is paid and you pay the top up from the staff exchange, it doesn't really matter where the salary comes from, as long as it's not from another MSCA project.
You see the questions?
Yeah, okay, so can we add so the Marie Curie Alumni Association as a beneficiary for staff exchange in the proposal? That's a good question. I'm not sure. Would you know, Claire? I guess it would be not as a beneficiary, probably.
I think as long as there is no double funding with the grants that they receive, I don't think it should be a problem.
Okay. Third question I see here, can institutions from third countries participating in the consortium get funding from the European Commission? It's a good question. So the third country institution will not be a beneficiary per se. So the money which is managed by the Research Executive Agency will not be transferred directly to the third country. However, within the consortium, of course, and I think that's what the previous speaker explained as well, you know, they can have arrangements between institutions to transfer part of the money between, you know, consortium members or project members. But then the final responsibility, of course, lies with the beneficiary. So what happens to those planned exchanges that are not regarded as interdisciplinary by the evaluators? Will they just be kicked out? So of course, if you don't fulfill the interdisciplinary rule, or well, if you do things that are not eligible, I mean, I don't know what you mean by kicked out, but then simply they're not eligible for funding under the project. So they could still take place. And in most cases they do take place, but then they're not eligible for funding under the projects. So are there limitations? Percentage of total budgets a single beneficiary and or single country can request within an MSCA project? I think this is a general question, staff exchange or other, I'm not sure. So within, I guess, the consortium.
Julien wants to intervene.
Yes.
Yes, sorry, very quickly. So I'm not sure whether it applies to RISE, but for doctoral networks at least, there are two kinds of third countries. And basically, if you check the guidelines for Horizon Europe, you will see the lists. But to make a long story short, low and medium income third countries, they can participate and get funded in a doctoral network. Of course, the consortium still needs to apply the, you know, the minimum eligibility condition, 3 different member states and associated countries, of which 1 member state, but they can participate and get funded. Now, the high income third countries, for instance, if you have the USA, Japan, Canada, they can participate, but normally they should not get funded from us. You still have some of these countries participating because they can get something out of the project, even if they don't get funded, but they normally should not get funded unless their participation is essential for the project. So for instance, if they have access to a very specific database that only they have, but then this will be judged by the evaluators. So if the evaluators say that, no, you cannot do this project without this participant from the USA, for instance, then there is a possibility that they get funded. I have to warn you that it remains very exceptional. And
it's the same, this rule also, yes, thanks for saying that, it's the same for RISE or staff exchange projects. So we make this distinction between you know, highly industrialized countries, which are not, I mean, they can participate, but they are not eligible for funding. So they should bring their own funds, which could be institutional funds, or, you know, if the Japanese government has some funds to contribute, then that's possible as well, but they will not benefit from the EU contribution of the project. So it's the same for staff exchanges. And I think I'm over time, so I'm going to hand over to Manuel, who's going to present, I think now, the COFUND action. So thanks a lot.
Thanks, Marlene. Thank you to all the colleagues for the introduction, and good afternoon from Brussels. And hello, just for those who may be watching us from all around the world. We are going to pass now to the next presentation, which is the COFUND action. As you heard in the introduction, there has been some fine-tuning, some slight adjustments sometimes in the terminology. In the case of COFUND, we retain even the same name of the action, so we are still thinking about MSCA COFUND, which is the action devoted to co-fund, to co-finance doctoral and postdoctoral programs. As we can see in the next slide, yes, sorry, I am gonna see if I can see better. Okay, now I can see better. Yeah, as we can see in the next slide, COFUND is a mono-beneficiary action. That means it's only one beneficiary signing the action, and is devoted to co-fund both new or existing national, regional, or institutional schemes for the training and career development of both researchers at doctoral or postdoctoral stage. The main goals, the main policy goals of the MSCA COFUND action is to spread the good practices of the MSCA throughout the participating organization by promoting the high standards, the good practices of the MSCA in terms of the high quality, open, merit-based, transparent recruitment procedures for the researchers, and also the good working, the excellent working conditions for the researchers, as stated, for example, in one of our main guiding documents, which is the Charter and Code for Researchers. It's also important to remember that MSCA COFUND projects should have a structuring effect on the institutions. I mean, these structural effects should have a sustainable impact on the institutions in order to promote excellent and sustainable research training and the 3 I's of the MSCA, the international, intersectoral, and interdisciplinary cooperation and mobility of researchers. Another important element of the MSCA COFUND action is the concept of synergies. MSCA COFUND particularly encourage, in general, the Horizon Europe program encourages synergies with cohesion policy funds, and sometimes now also with recovery and resilience facility plans, programs, state established for the post-COVID recovery. But for the particular case of MSCA COFUND, this concept of synergies with what we call in the past structural investment funds, the SIF, the cohesion policy funds, is particularly important. And the programs, the doctoral, postdoctoral programs of MSCA COFUND can, let's say, be of generic nature, or they could also focus on specific disciplines. And we see sometimes that we see often programs focused on specific disciplines, notably when they are based on the research and innovation smart specialization strategies. As we can see in the next slide, the main features of the program, this is a program with 2 main target groups. As I said, it can be for doctoral programs or for postdoctoral programs. So depending on the case, the candidates, the researchers, should be researchers without a doctoral degree at the deadline of the COFUND program's goals. It's important also to clarify this, that the defining date is the deadline of the specific goals of the programs. And then there is a mandatory enrollment in the doctoral program of the researchers. So this is the case of the doctoral programs, and then we have the case of the postdoctoral researchers, where researchers should have a doctoral degree at the deadline of the co-funded program's goal. So here we see that, let's say, the determining factor is the same as for other actions, doctoral networks or postdoctoral fellowships, is if the researchers have or don't have a doctoral degree. Who applies? As I said in the first slide, is a mono-beneficiary action. That means it's a single legal entity signing the grant agreement. This entity should be established in an EU member state or associated country. But of course, beneficiaries may be accompanied, and usually they come accompanied with a number of associated partners. And in this regard, the MSCA COFUND action strongly encourages the signature of a partnership agreement to have things clearly established since the very beginning. There is also the case of what we sometimes call the cascading grants. This is the case of a beneficiary that could be, for example, a funding agency, and which is, let's say, being the beneficiary of the action, but then there are implementing partners really recruiting and hosting the fellows, the researchers. There is a minimum of 3 researchers of the program established or recruited by the programs. So less than 3 researchers cannot be recruited by the programs. And then, as mentioned in previous presentations, there is an important concept, a very strong focus on the career development and supervision of researchers in the new MSCA under Horizon Europe. And this is why MSCA COFUND requires a career development plan to be jointly established by the supervisor and each recruited researcher upon recruitment, and then to be revised if needed and updated if needed within 18 months. As we can see in the next slide, the features in terms of co-funding, I mean, by definition, this is a COFUND program. So the MSCA COFUND has a maximum limit of 10 million per beneficiary and per call. This is something that is not changed compared to the previous Horizon 2020 MSCA COFUND action. And then this one of the novelties or the main changes that comes here is the nature, the design of the EU contribution in COFUND under Horizon Europe. The EU contribution in COFUND covers the minimum remuneration of the researchers. For those that sometimes there is frequent question what is the meaning of this percentage, this calculation, you can take the living plus mobility allowance of the doctoral networks. If you calculate the 70%, this is the EU contribution for MSCA COFUND doctoral programs. And if you do the same for postdoctoral fellowships, you would end up with the EU contribution for MSCA postdoctoral programs. So first of all, we are increasing in some way the EU contribution from the previous 50% to the 70%, which is exactly the same amount of the minimum remuneration that we are requesting to the programs to pay to the researchers. And this COFUND allowance can be used in a more flexible way. This is why we call it even COFUND allowance. We are not speaking of the different categories of the unit contributions, such as living and mobility or research training networking. So it can be used in a more flexible way. It also has an impact even in the concept of synergies, because also the different, let's say, chapters may be partially or fully covered by either the EU contribution or additional sources, including EU sources. Then another novelty in MSCA COFUND is the introduction of an MSCA COFUND Seal of Excellence for applications scoring 85%. This is something that already existed in MSCA individual fellowships and will exist, as you will see later, probably in the presentation on postdoctoral fellowships. So we are introducing the Seal of Excellence for MSCA COFUND for those applications that have an excellent score over 85%, but unfortunately they didn't have a sufficiently high score to be in the main list to be eligible for funding. I mean, at the end of the day, they are not eligible, or they are not selected for funding just due to budget reasons. In terms of the duration of the program, we don't change it. It's up to 5 years, 60 months, and then there is a minimum duration of the fellowships for 3 months. Regarding the secondments, they should be of up to 1/3 of the duration of the fellowship. And if we are speaking, for example, of the case of outgoing postdoctoral program COFUND programs fellows, we are speaking of 1/3 of the outgoing phase. The dates, similar comment as Marlene said, COFUND, we are also opening in October. So opposite to what happens with doctoral networks or postdoctoral, MSCA COFUND is not still open. We'll open in October 2021 and will close in February 2022. As we can see in the next slide, we see the table of the unit contributions. And this is what I, let's say, briefly explained before. We see a bit different construction compared to other actions. We have a flexible COFUND allowance that may be used in the different cost categories, but it amounts exactly the amount corresponding to the minimum remuneration. That's it. That beneficiaries, in principle, may use the COFUND allowance to cover the minimum remuneration And in principle, particularly for certain countries, they will be, let's say, covered. They will be covering the minimum remuneration. But this remuneration, this EU contribution can also be used for other cost categories if you find, I mean, the ways to build another, let's say, funding scheme. Then you have also the other contributions that have been mentioned in previous presentations for long-term allowance or for special needs allowance. And finally, in the next slide, let's visit briefly the award criteria, excellence, impact, and quality of efficiency of implementation, of course. And starting with the excellence, COFUND pays attention to the quality and novelty of the program itself, their selection and recruitment process for the researchers, and also the appointment conditions, including the competitiveness of the salary. This is why I come back to my previous comments. In principle, the COFUND allowance is covering the minimum remuneration, but of course, depending on the hosting country, the country where the hosting institution is based, the applicants, the beneficiaries, may need to demonstrate that they are paying a competitive remuneration to the researcher, and this may go above and beyond the remuneration, the EU contribution from COFUND. There is also, I mean, focus on the quality of research options, including also the open science practices. This is a common term for all the actions. I mean, we embrace the principles of open science and also responsible research and innovation. This is why we are introducing this under the excellence criterion, as in other parts of Horizon Europe. And then also the quality of research training program and the quality of supervision and career guidance. So at the end of the day, most of the things that we have been commenting during this short presentation. And then the impact, let's just briefly say that we are, I mean, the proposals will be evaluated against the quality or the impact, sorry, on the researchers, so on their career perspectives, the impact on the institutions and systems, so how the good practices are spread at institutional, regional, national, international level, and also the impact of the research itself and how, I mean, the measures to maximize the outcomes and impacts that the applicants will have to show in the dissemination and exploitation plan. And finally, the quality and efficiency of the implementation. It's, let's say, the third criterion that you see below as in previous framework programs. There is the priority order. In principle, this is the criterion with the lower, let's say, weight in the evaluation. Quality of the work plan, the management structures, the risk assessment, and finally the hosting arrangements of the different participants. With this, I finish my presentation, and I will be glad to take some questions. Thank you. And maybe I can visit also, sorry, because I lost for a second the screen of the return screen. So should I read? I have some questions in front of me.
Yes, you should.
Yeah, for the MSCA COFUND proposals, is there a minimum contribution from the applicant in terms of co-funding compared with the EC contribution? Yeah, thanks for the question, James. Exactly, this is more or less what I tried to explain. It might be that these questions, how would I say, is inspired by the previous funding scheme of MSCA COFUND and the Horizon 2020, where we were funding part of the minimum remuneration. Now, in principle, the mandatory requirement for the programs, the really mandatory requirement stated in the work program, is to pay the minimum remuneration. And the COFUND EU contribution is exactly that amount. So programs that use the EU contribution to pay the minimum remuneration would be in principle covering the mandatory minimum requirement of the programs. But it's true that beyond that, as I tried to explain, it could be that in certain countries where the cost of life is higher, applicants' proposals will have to explain that they are really paying a competitive salary. But in principle, by default, there is not a minimum top up by the applicants because the EU contribution covers the minimum remuneration. Is it compulsory to implement the charter and code in the human resources applicants policies or to obtain the HRS and the Human Resources Strategy for Researchers Award? Well, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, the application of the charter, of course, is, let's say, a best effort and approach. I mean, in principle, the charter for researchers and the code of conduct for recruitment of researchers is one of the main guiding principles of the MSCA before in Horizon 2020 and also in Horizon Europe. So it's important that these principles are taken into account in the implementation of your projects if they are selected. And now we have a third question. The budget limit is exclusively applied to beneficiary, not to any associate partner who recruits researchers. Budget limit. Okay, I hope I understand well the question. When we are speaking about limits in terms of money, if I may say, it's limits of 10 million per beneficiary and per call is the EU contribution. So then this is the limit that the funding program will pay to participants. So then if there is a higher budget, then this will have to be covered by the participants. I mean, if there is an extra cost that goes beyond the EU contribution, this is to be covered by the participants. For a doctoral program, is there funding for the tuition? I think there was a similar question in previous presentation, and the reply should be similar. If I'm not mistaken, the concept tuition is not specifically mentioned in the work program, but in the annotated model grant agreements is mentioned that at the end of the day, researchers shouldn't pay by themselves these tuition fees. I mean, it should be covered by the programs. So it's not, I mean, if the EU contribution is used for the remuneration of the researchers, this is for their remuneration, and they shouldn't cope with the cost of the tuition fees. This should be, let's say, addressed or covered by the hosting institutions. For MSCA COFUND, does the institution need to prove the co-funding for the financial report? Again, I mean, this is an MSCA COFUND action, so we are trying to flexibilize the EU contribution. In some way, we still call it COFUND because we are covering, let's say by default, one of the main budget or expenditure categories, which is the remuneration of the researcher. And then if there are other costs, for example, for the management of the action, this will have to be covered by the applicants. So then it's not that they need to prove, it's that they need to, I mean, to cover the costs that would come for research, training, networking, for management costs, and so on and so forth. And for example, if program decides then to have also a family allowance, they will have to pay with alternative, with complementary funding sources beyond MSCA, Horizon Europe, MSCA COFUND EU contribution. When will the final resolution of COFUND 2020 be published with the funded projects, including possible selection of projects initial in the reserve list? Thanks. Okay, this is not exactly a question of the Horizon Europe Info Day, but we are glad to reply. This follows the standard procedure that our colleagues in the executive agency, REA, who are, let's say, the masters of this part of the implementation of the program, piloted all the evaluation, selection of experts, steering the consensus meetings, final panel and ranking list, including the main list and the reserve list. And then for these reserve list projects, there is a procedure to evaluate what is the budget available and the potential, let's say, candidate proposals, which are those, let's say, of course, leading in the reserve lists. And then this, it's, let's say, in the final stages of discussion and decision, and it will follow the standard, let's say, procedure of communication to the program committee, I mean, the delegations of the member states, and also communication to the finally selected applicant or applicants, depending on the finally available budget for extra projects. The secondments need to be paid out by the beneficiary. As I said, in principle, the COFUND allowance is a flexible one. You need to define the best funding scheme for your program, but you do need to ensure that the minimum remuneration is paid to the researcher. So in principle, if you use the COFUND allowance to pay the remuneration, you will have to find complementary funding sources to cover the cost of other items, like could be the secondments. This is by definition a COFUND program, so there is not, let's say, 100%, because even by definition in the regulation of Horizon Europe, program COFUND actions should have a maximum, let's say, threshold of funding. In principle, we are not covering all costs, as might happen in other MSCA actions. Similar concept is a flexible COFUND allowance, and then you may decide to use the EU contribution, the COFUND allowance, to cover partially management or indirect costs, but is, let's say, up to the applicants to decide the best funding scheme, but the remuneration needs to be ensured. In case I didn't stress sufficiently, it's also important to recall the concept of synergies, that also applicants are particularly strongly encouraged, invited to search for potential funding synergies with alternative funding sources at regional, national, international level, including EU funding sources such as the cohesion policy funds, to cover those costs that are not covered by the EU contribution. Yes, can a beneficiary who runs a Horizon 2020 COFUND apply for a new one under Horizon Europe? Yes, definitely. I mean, no limitation in this regard. So a beneficiary who runs a Horizon 2020 COFUND project may run a new project under Horizon Europe. And I think we are already a bit over time, so in principle, we should be finishing. Partner organization recruiting a fellow, in principle, is the, in the case of the cascading grants that I mentioned, where the implementing partners may be, let's say, hosting and recruiting the fellows, but in principle is the beneficiaries who receive the funding, and these beneficiaries should be established in an associated country or a member state. So if I am not mistaken, there are no more questions, and we are now finishing this session. We are heading towards a short break of 13, 14 minutes. And then you are kindly invited to join the next session focused on supporting excellent research through experienced researchers, so mostly postdoctoral fellowships. That should start at 4, and then you should click the next link in the web page to join that session that starts at 4 p.m. Brussels time. Thank you.